I think we are ready to start finally. Sorry for the brief delay. This presentation is CKEditor 5 for Drupal developers. Can we get the slides up too? Okay, perfect. So on the session description, I said this is an intermediate session. That's a very subjective thing to say. So that depends on the background that you're holding, whether this is an intermediate, advanced, or beginner session. I chose the middle one because I don't think there is necessarily a strict background requirement to understand what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm not going to talk about things that would assume that you've used CKEditor 5 before, or that you would have done development on CKEditor 5 before. But the things that I'm going to be talking about are going to be complex, are going to be hard to grasp. And that is exactly the reason I wanted to talk about this, so that we can spread some of the knowledge that we've learned on CKEditor 5 so far. So if you feel like it's hard to follow, it's too advanced for you, and you don't want to dig into the deep end on the JavaScript stuff that we are talking about later, no hard feelings from my end if you want to leave in the middle. Just wanted to say that before we start. I am lauriii. I'm a staff software engineer currently based in Helsinki. I am working in the Drupal acceleration team in Akuya, and I'm also a Drupal front-end framework manager, one of them, and a contributor to the CKEditor 5 Drupal core module. So first, one might be wondering, why are we updating to CKEditor 5? The reason for doing that is because CKEditor 4 is end of life in 2023. It has served us well for the past decade, but yeah, it's always time to move on at some point. As Wim presented earlier on the initiative keynote, we had 3 goals on this project to upgrade from CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5. That was to ensure that content created with any configuration in CKEditor 4 would allow at least the data that was created with CKEditor 4 to be retained when edited in CKEditor 5. We wanted to make the upgrade path as smooth as possible because we knew that there are a lot of people using CKEditor 4. So when we can remove steps from the upgrade process, that combined time saving from everyone would be a significant factor to the experience and sort of the overall time spent on upgrading from CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5. We also wanted to make sure that any integrations that we have with CKEditor are matching with the overall experience that users have when they use CKEditor 5. So that meant revisiting the UX of modules like the Drupal Media and image upload to make sure that they are aligned with the overall experience. So we started working on this 2 years ago. That's when we started doing some planning, figuring out is CKEditor 5 what we wanted to go with or something else. And here's how the roadmap looks like. This is what we've achieved in the last 1.5 years. So yeah, it's definitely been sort of a long road coming here. So yeah, it's been pretty significant. And also, this doesn't show any of the work that the CKEditor 5 team in CK Source have done to make this possible. They've basically had a dedicated team working on making sure that Drupal is able to upgrade to CKEditor 5 for the last, I would say, 1 to 1.5 years, which is very significant from their end as well, to make sure that everything is working as expected. So yeah, basically without their support, we wouldn't be where we are today. With the collaboration that we've had with them, we have been able to ship CKEditor 5 as an experimental module in Drupal 9.3.0. And if you haven't already tested it out, we are doing some testing on site here in the event, in the sprints. We've been finding lots of bugs so far. I don't think there's been anyone testing CKEditor 5 module yet without finding bugs. So it's been a very interesting experience so far, very bumpy. But I guess that's also proves a point that is a very valuable work for all of the testers to be doing, because of that will help us provide a better experience for the other folks who are going to be upgrading later on. In theory, the upgrade path should look pretty much like this. So switching from CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5 on the text format, and we provide some messages that explain what were the trade-offs that were made when we selected the configuration for CKEditor 5. because it's very hard to do one-to-one upgrade from CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5. So yeah, we recommend reading the messages that we provide there, even though they can be pretty long, because there's a lot of nuance to selecting the plugins and configuration in CKEditor 5. But that definitely does help you understand when upgrading to CKEditor 5, sort of what are the differences that are happening as a result of upgrading to CKEditor 5. One of the interesting use cases that we've worked on quite a bit is making sure that full HTML use case is supported in CKEditor 5. Even though the full HTML use case is something that is not really considered as a best practice because there are some security considerations with that. For example, if you give an inexperienced user access to a full HTML text format, they could self-XSS themselves, because when you are using full HTML text format, all of the content filtering from CKEditor 4 is disabled. So yeah, definitely not something that is considered as a best practice, still done quite a lot. So we wanted to make sure that even the users who are using this approach with CKEditor 4 will be able to upgrade to CKEditor 5. We've done some testing on this to a certain extent, but because in full HTML, there is infinite amount of different options how you can nest your markup. It is very hard to make sure that all of the different edge cases are covered. And for that reason, in particular, if you are using full HTML with CKEditor 5, we encourage that you do testing on this early, potentially on site here or at home, and provide us with feedback on how your experience was when testing with the full HTML text format with CKEditor 5. I'm going to explain later what are the changes that make it very difficult for us to support full HTML. But yeah, let's basically jump into that next. So circling back to CKEditor 4. So CKEditor 4 is basically a visual text editor for HTML. It uses HTML at its core. HTML is the data model that it uses. In the Drupal community, we've had some folks calling it an assistive rich text editor, which makes it very apparent that it's just a tool which assists you to write HTML. That also makes it clear that it's trying to cater a more technical audience instead of the sort of content editor audience, because it's basically just a tool for writing HTML. Something that's interesting in the technical community has been to see that creating HTML with tools like this has seen as inferior over creating manual in ways where you have more control over the HTML, such as just creating your HTML manually, or using templates where you can control all the different aspects on how your page is rendered. And that reminds me of when I got started on front-end development back in the day. That was when front-end engineering was done with FrontPage 97, and later on with Adobe Dreamweaver. And in a sense, that's a very similar kind of tool. It's basically just a graphical user interface which assists you to write HTML, and then you can sort of see what are the changes that are happening in the HTML as you make changes in the UI. When I was working on FrontPage 97 and on Adobe Dreamweaver, gradually I started realizing that, yeah, these are the changes that are happening in HTML. And I also realized that the HTML that the tool was writing was quite bloated. It was adding a lot of unnecessary things that were actually not required for what I was trying to achieve. And that meant that I was sort of gradually transforming from using the user interface to writing that HTML manually. These days, it's not very common actually to write HTML manually. So yeah, we've moved quite far from here. And I think what we are doing quite a bit these days is structured data. And in the Drupal ecosystem, a popular tool for this has been paragraphs. And with nested paragraphs, you can do actually quite a few different kinds of things in a structured format. Like I think basically almost anything that you could do in in Dreamweaver, for example, you could do in a structured format like this if you went very complex with your data model. This allows front-end developers to decide how that structured data should be rendered, and that can be controlled in templates. The downside of this approach has been that the user obviously can't really imagine how the data will look like on the page. This is pretty far from the actual rendered page. That's where CKEditor comes in. And what is exciting about CKEditor 5, or one of the things that is exciting about CKEditor 5, is that it's no longer just an HTML editor. So basically, CKEditor 4, HTML in core. HTML is the data model. CKEditor 5 can go way beyond from that. So CKEditor 5 has its own data model instead of using the DOM as its data model. We will talk about that a lot more soon. What is exciting about that is that allows CKEditor to use non-HTML data sources, such as Markdown. And that could be extended to even more advanced use cases, such as JSON or XML. Implementing its own data model also enables some very advanced use cases, such as collaborative editing and support for complex data structures, like you could imagine some complex use cases like what we saw earlier. There's also major benefits to the developer experience because of CKEditor 5 is no longer directly impacted by the DOM handling of different browsers. And for example, if you have to see how the conversion is happening with CKEditor 4, since that happens inside the browser always, and browser is controlling all of the different aspects of the conversion, you have to be doing the debugging within the browser itself, like inside the internals of the browser. But since CKEditor 5 is now controlling all of the aspects of the conversion, you can set breakpoints in your JavaScript code, which web developers are much more familiar with. So here's an example of the data model and how that would look like in the different states. So on the left, we can see a mock of how the user view could look like. On the middle, there's data, which in this case is HTML, and that would be what would be stored in the database when you save the data. Then we have the model on the right, which is the internal data model in CKEditor 5. You can see that most of the things there make sense. They're quite easy to figure out. For example, a P element is now a paragraph, and H1 is a heading 1. What is interesting there is that, for example, the strong is converted to an attribute. That sort of just makes it easier for CKEditor 5 to be able to handle that. But we don't really have to be too concerned about that. It's just an example of how the internal CKEditor 5 data model can be quite different from the HTML in some cases. On top of the architectural changes, the UI has received some very significant improvements. With the new crisp UX, CKEditor 5 is able to provide much more value compared to being just a rich text editor for HTML. I would say that CKEditor 5 is a content creation tool for people who are not developers. And as a result of that, it's basically able to compete to other content creation tools like Google Docs. CKEditor team went as far as to not include the source editing mode when they started working on CKEditor 5. It was added actually just maybe a year ago or so, because that was one of the requirements for us in the Drupal community to be able to provide upgrade path from CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5. Here's an example of how editing alt text would happen through this bubble UI, which they're using quite a bit in CKEditor 5. In CKEditor 4, that would happen through a modal dialog. So this is a much more smoother experience that CKEditor 5 is able to provide. That's obviously just like sort of something that they've been able to do on top of the modernized architecture that they have. So I'm going to navigate through the sort of internals of CKEditor 5 to the extent what is needed to create a simple CKEditor 5 plugin. And we're going to do that by looking at a demo project, which is a 2-column layout element, which we're going to implement here. And I have the code that you can use if you want to create a plugin later on available. I have a link for that at the end of the presentation. So you can just copy and paste all of the code examples. So no need to try to write down everything during this session. They are just to sort of try to help the learning experience by providing an example. So here's the end goal that we have in mind. So basically, we can see that there's some text on the left. There's another column on the right for an image in this case. So basically, yeah, we should be able to set content in 2 columns in this layout. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out what is the schema of this new element. So instead of using HTML, as I mentioned, CKEditor 4, like CKEditor 4 does, CKEditor 5 has its own schema, where we basically have to define what are the allowed elements that this plugin supports. It can do some much more advanced things that you would do with the DOM, where basically in CKEditor 4, you can define these are the elements that I allow. So let's say you allow a H1 and you allow a P element. Any combination of valid HTML with those elements would be accepted from the CKEditor 4's perspective. But with the CKEditor 5 data model, you can provide a stricter rules on top of that. So for example, you can say that the paragraph can never be inside a heading. So in practice, what that means is that every element in the schema of CKEditor 5 needs to have information about how it can be nested. What are the allowed parents? What are the allowed children? Where can you insert this element? What can be inside this element? Then you need to define what are the allowed attributes on that element or text node. So for example, an image can have the src attribute or an alt attribute. But for example, for a heading, those attributes would not make sense at all. So the schema for the heading would not allow those attributes to be added, whereas the image schema would have to allow those. There's also a room for additional semantics about the model nodes. For example, image would be a type of object, paragraph would be a block type. I'm not going to go into the details of what those means. I guess what is interesting about that is that it can be used by CKEditor for figuring out how features and the engine should be rendering those in the UI, how is the editing experience, and how to process them in the model. So for example, if you press an enter inside that element, should it go outside that element, or should it stay inside that element? Things like that. That can make then the experience of editing much smoother. But basically, I guess the interesting part or the key takeaway from here is that CKEditor 5 only handles known elements. So they need to be somehow defined in the schema. And that also has created a lot of challenges. For example, for the full HTML use case, where we have no idea what HTML are you going to place inside there, because you can basically do anything that you want in there. So in our case, we want to define two new elements in the schema. So we are setting a toCol element and col element. So the toCol element is a wrapper, which defines that this is a layout, which can have 2 columns. And then we have a col element, which is each of the columns. We basically define that where can you place the toCol element? We say $block in there, which means that it can be placed anywhere where $block is allowed. Then in the call element, we specify in the allow in toCol, which means that you can only insert that call element inside the toCol element. So you would not be able to insert it anywhere else. Inside the call element, we specify that can have a content of $root, which means it's again a variable, which means that anything that is allowed to be placed inside $root would be allowed in here. And that is quite a few elements that are allowed in $root. You can imagine that would be almost all elements except some exceptions like li or td, which would be only allowed in a certain other kind of element like table and ul/ol. So the next concept we have to sort of talk about is conversion. And that is required because CKEditor 5 works on 2 separate layers, model and view. So there needs to be a process for transforming one of those layers into another. And that is called conversion. So each plugin is responsible for setting up conversion for the elements that it supports. So that's basically something that we have to do in this case. So the first thing that we have to figure out is Upcast conversion. So when you load data into the editor, a temporary view is created out of that data. And the initial data could be HTML or Markdown or something more complex than that. And the view is an abstraction of that raw data. And that makes it possible for the plugins to support multiple data sources. So that makes it possible that the plugin doesn't specifically have to know about Markdown or HTML. So then with the help of the Upcast converters, the model is created as a result. And once that is done, the model becomes the editor state. And the model is basically the single source of truth for the editor state. and the temporary data view that was created as part of this Upcast conversion is now discarded. And that's how basically the state, that's how the model was created. And that happens every time any data is being loaded to the editor. So that could be, for example, when you paste content into the editor, or when you just load the page with some text area that contains some data. So yeah, so this process is called the Upcast conversion. Then the opposite of the Upcast conversion is the Downcast conversion. So that's when we get the model into the data. And there's two pipelines over here. So there's the data conversion and there's editing conversion. So the data view is for what is stored in the database. So that is basically what we started from. And then we have the editing view, which is for showing the preview for the editor. And that is needed because of some elements in the editor must have some extra affordances to render the element correctly in the preview. So you can imagine like maybe some borders around the element or things like that, which make the editing smoother. So that's why two of these views are different. If you have a simple element, most of the time the downcast would be the same for both of these. If you have complex elements, then these could be quite widely different from each other. The editing downcast process happens every time the model changes. So that's how basically the editing view gets updated. And that's how the editing view is also born. So it always comes from the model. There's no other way to create the editing view. And that means typing, pasting from the clipboard, anything like that. That is applied to the model and then downcast to the editing view. Then there's the data downcast, and that is happening when the data that is stored in the database or somewhere else needs to be converted. That could be when you submit the form to save it, or for example, if you want to copy text from the editor somewhere else. That's when the downcast needs to happen also on that part of the model. And basically, the data downcast, which is on the left, should result in the same markup as you started, same data as what you started from. So that's where we see sort of the big picture of that. So the data view goes to the model, data downcast gets it back to the data view, and then the editing view is a separate process from that. Okay, I'm gonna do a very brief live demo on this. Okay, so I'm using here a CKEditor dev tool, and I'm going to insert Drupal media in here, which is one of those sort of little bit more complex use cases that you could imagine. If we look at the model, so this is basically the model, single source of truth for everything. We can see that it simply has a UUID that we have in the database for the Drupal media. It has some metadata about how the media should be aligned. And then if we look at the view, this is the editing view. So this is essentially what is rendered in the editor. And you can see that is quite different from what is there. We render a figure element, and then we have a div here. And this would actually contain markup rendered by the backend, which is the preview. So that is quite an advanced use case compared to some of the examples of using paragraphs and things like that. Then if we press the source in here, that allows us to inspect the data downcast. So this is essentially what will be stored in the database. Now, if we change the data here, we get another upcast, which happens. So we basically change the data view in there, which now gets upcast into the model. And as a result of that, we see that in the model there's a paragraph. And from there, to show the preview, there would be another downcast happening to the editing view. Now, if we edit the content here, we can see that the model is manipulated directly. And as a result of that, also the editing downcast is being triggered again. So that was the very brief live demo on this. Okay. So here's the data model of the two-call element with the schema that we defined. So we have a two-call element, and then we have two columns inside that. In the data view, what we want to have is a section with a class, div with a class, basically a specific classes that we can recognize, and that is what we are going to use for this. So what we are going to do next is set up conversion for that. What is pretty cool is that CKEditor provides some very useful tools for setting up these conversions. There are tools that allow you to go on a very low level, define the nitty-gritty details on how things should be converted, but most of simple cases would be able to use something like the element-to-element conversion, which simply defines that this is the model element that I have, and in the view, this is how it is represented. So it would basically have a name, that's the name of the element, and then we have the classes that have to be in the view so that it is considered to be this model element. So we have set up that for both the two-call and the call element. This is basically a very simple example here, because this is also setting up both upcast and downcast conversion using the same information. Most of the time, I think you would potentially set up the upcast and downcast separately, because there could be minor differences in how you want that to happen. But since this is a very simple example, we can use the same element-to-element function call with the same properties to do both of the processes, upcast and downcast. Then we also saw how the model was being manipulated. And how that happens, or how that works, is that CKEditor 5 implements a standardized way to manipulate the model based on operations. The CKEditor 5 operation system is based on operational transformations algorithm, which enables some of the very complex use cases that they want to support. That includes cases like real-time collaboration editing solutions, which are offered by CKSource as a commercial product. And CKSource, as far as I know, they've told us that they are working on making the commercial product available to use with Drupal too. So if you're interested in something like that, feel free to reach out at them. So on the side, on the left side, we can see a few examples of commands which are acting as the high-level API. We can see that even rudimentary things like pressing enter are handled through these commands. And those commands then in turn trigger these operations. And on the operations level, they sort of figure out how in which order certain things should be run. And that is using the operational transformations algorithm to work. So for example, if you have the cursor in the middle of a paragraph and you press enter key, you can see what happens as a result of that on the right side. We insert a paragraph and we move the rest of that paragraph, the text that is inside that paragraph, inside that new paragraph that was just created. If you are familiar with OT, what could be interesting to know that on top of the basic operations that OT usually supports, insert, remove, and set attribute, CKEditor provides some additional operations that make working in these very complex data structures easier. So for example, CKEditor 5 has an operation for renaming an element which makes sense, for example, if a paragraph should be changed into a heading. They have a lot of these operations, so it is quite easy from developer perspective to write a plugin, because you don't have to worry about these complex use cases such as collaborative editing, because it's all abstracted out so that you can just use the high-level APIs. What is also interesting to note is that you can call these commands basically from anywhere, so it doesn't have to even be in the CKEditor 5 code. That could be happening outside the editor if something outside the editor should be triggering some of these commands. So as I mentioned, the API that is exposed here is commands. And those are used for executing actions and keeping state. For instance, the bold command applies or removes the bold attribute from the selected text. Commands have two properties by default, value and is enabled, as we can see over here. If the text in which the selection is placed has bold applied already, the value is true. And that's basically the state that we have here. If it doesn't have bold applied, it is false. If the bold command can be executed on the current selection, is enabled is true, so that's what we have here. if it cannot be executed on the current selection, is enabled would be false. So that would be basically this enabled would be set based on whether you have something selected that could be bolded. So for example, if the selection currently is an image element, it doesn't make sense to allow making that bold. If the current selection is text, which could be marked as bold, then we would have this enabled. And those rules are defined in the schema. So the schema defines what is allowed, what is not allowed. So image would basically just not be allowed. The image schema would not allow that to happen. So here's an example of structure of a class that extends the CKEditor 5 command class. So there's two functions that we have here, and then we have the refresh and execute. The refresh function is responsible for keeping the state up to date. So that's the is enabled and value. And that happens based on what are the changes that are happening in model. That includes changes to the selection. Then we have the execute, which would run if is enabled is true. And that would then be responsible for triggering those operations in the lower level APIs. So here's an example of how the refresh could look like for our toCall element. So we are basically setting the is enabled based on whether the toCall element is allowed in the current selection. So if you are if the cursor is in a position where you can enter this element, we would allow this to be inserted. And we are basically just checking that by checking the schema for if the current element, if the toCall element is allowed in the parent of the selected in the selected position. Get first position is basically if you have selection where you have text selected, so it's not just a cursor, but you have actually text selected. So you would start from the beginning of that selection, check if you can insert it from there. And what would happen if there's text selected? It would basically just overwrite that text. It would remove that text from there as a result of this. Then we have the execute function, which is basically just a callback which we would run when someone wants to insert a toCall element. And this would only run if the is enabled property is true. That the command class sort of is responsible for checking that outside of what is happening here. We're triggering a new batch of changes to the model. And why it's important to note that it's a batch of changes is that we could make multiple changes in here. And there's an undo plugin which allows you to undo changes and redo changes later on if you've undone some changes. And basically what it means that we have a batch is that even if you make multiple things inside this batch, all of them will be reverted by one undo action, which would be clicking the undo button once. Basically what we're doing here is we are creating the elements. So we create the toCall element, then we are creating the two columns inside that. We basically just have to insert those in the toCall. What might be interesting to note is that we are also creating paragraphs inside those elements. We are taking a reference to one of the paragraphs because we want to provide a good user experience as part of this. We want to move the selection inside the first column, inside the paragraph of the first column. So that sort of, if you insert the toCall element, then immediately you're able to continue editing inside the first column of that layout. Then we have to provide a UI plugin, and UI plugin is very similar to the editing plugin, but instead of providing a conversion, what it provides a UI element using the component factory. So basically, we are using a button view here, which is a CKEditor 5 provided component. It makes it easy for us to provide buttons that behave the same way as the buttons that CKEditor 5 uses internally. And basically, with a very simple few properties, we can define a button which is exactly the same as any other button in the toolbar. So we just have to specify an icon, a label, and then we tell it that this is a tooltip button, so that if you hover over that button, it would show a tooltip that explains what the button does. So this is basically the basic, these properties are needed for just rendering the button in the UI itself. We need to do a few additional things on top of that to integrate to the command. So we are, for example, binding the isEnabled property of the command to isEnabled property of the button. So that means that if the command is not enabled, so if you can't insert a to-call element in the current selection, then the button should be also disabled in that case. So the user can see that, okay, I can't insert the to-call here. The button is disabled for that reason. Then we also have to map the button view execute event to execute the insert to call command. So that's the command which we created earlier. So basically that is all that is happening in the UI level. We just tell it to execute that command which we created, and that's all. So that's all that you need for creating this plugin in the CKEditor. If you create a plugin which only works with CKEditor 5. But we need a couple of extra things to be able to integrate that plugin with Drupal. So CKEditor 5 has a plugin-based architecture. In CKEditor 5, everything is a plugin, even the critical features, such as support for typing or paragraph elements. The CKEditor 5 Drupal module is responsible for providing, for loading those plugins. And this happens through a Drupal plugin manager. It is possible to add new plugins or replace existing ones with your own implementations if you need to do some customization on how the editor should work. So in this case, we are basically just adding this to-call element as a new plugin. And the minimum information that you need for a plugin is going to be what are the plugins that need to be loaded. So basically, that would be telling that. So you can see on the right side on the plugins, we say layer cake to-call. Layer cake is the name of the bundle, the DLL bundle where we provide that plugin. I'm going to explain DLL in a moment. That is a requirement for all CKEditor 5 plugins using Drupal. So CKEditor works without Webpack DLL, but the Drupal integration of CKEditor 5 requires Webpack DLL. The second part of that plugin name is simply the name of the plugin, which we defined in CKEditor 5. Then you also need to provide a label, so that is needed for the admin UI, and then you need to provide HTML elements that it can generate. And it's important that you provide as accurate information about the HTML elements that your CKEditor plugin can generate, because that information is used for the admin UI to do the upgrade paths and things like that. Also, that impacts what elements users are able to add to the source editing plugin. So, for example, in this case, we're telling that this plugin specifically supports diff with class layout call. But if we said that it was diff class, that would be a lie, because of this plugin only supports a certain class. It does not support all classes or all different values of class for diffs. And then if a user tried to add in the source editing the diff class, we would basically recommend them to install this plugin, because we think that this plugin can handle that case. Same would happen on the upgrade path. So for example, if someone had diff class enabled to CKEditor 4, and we tell in this plugin that this plugin supports diff class, we would try to enable that plugin to fulfill the need that the user has in CKEditor 5, even though that would not be true for this module. Just a reminder that it's important to provide as accurate information as possible. Here's a very hectic graph of the Webpack DLL. The basic concept of Webpack DLL is that it allows us to split JavaScript bundles from having a one bundle to having multiple bundles. And that allows us to load plugins dynamically from modules without having to maintain a single build. So if we would maintain a single build, we would essentially have to have a development dependency on Node.js, because every time a module with a new CKEditor 5 plugin was installed, the bundle would have to be regenerated. So with Webpack DLL, each module is responsible for building their own plugins. And CKEditor 5 export two files. One JavaScript file which contains their JavaScript, and then, so that's basically the JavaScript bundle. And then they have another file which contains metadata about what is inside that file, what are the exported functions from the source. The reason why, I don't think anyone needs to fully understand how Webpack works, so don't have that expectation. That is not a requirement for you to work on CKEditor 5. The reason why it's important is that you are aware that this is a concept which exists. Here's the brief explanation on why we are doing that. And the reason why I'm explaining it is because that's probably the number one asked question that we have. Because people try to load a non-Webpack DLL built plugin in CKEditor 5, and it's not working because of it needs to be built with Webpack DLL. And how you would do that is you basically need these few lines in your Webpack configuration. You have to tell it to use DLL reference plugin, and you have to tell it that the manifest file is the manifest file that the CKEditor 5 provides as part of their build. Just copy and paste this, and it will work for you if you have the CKEditor 5 plugin defined as a dependency of your plugin. Yeah, so it's kind of, it's magic. I don't think you have to understand in detail how all of this works. Yeah, it's all good. So the Drupal, so based on the metadata, we've been able to, or with the help of the metadata, we've been able to make some improvements to the admin UI. So the filter HTML, allow HTML tags or attributes are no longer set manually like you do with CKEditor 4. This is now based on the information that the plugins provide. It is basically generated as part of, based on the information that is provided here. So we can tell the filter HTML that these are the elements, these are the attributes that are needed for these plugins to work. So unlike with CKEditor 4, where the filter HTML configuration was used to determine the enabled features. So for example, if you had H1, H2, H3 enabled in the filter HTML, the format plugin would show those in the UI based on what you have configured in the filter HTML. In CKEditor 5, that has been reversed so that the plugin is responsible for telling that these are the headings that this plugin supports, and filter HTML then uses that information for generating the configuration for that filter. If you have manually editable tags or attributes, those can be added as part of the source editing plugin with the similar experience as previously with the filter HTML. So if you want to have manually configurable elements, that is still possible with the source editing. And we have integration for that, which allow you to configure the HTML elements and attributes that you want to be editable there. So now let's take a look at how all of this work together. So I'm going to go to the admin UI. What I'm going to do is, so this is the to-call button which we just created. I'm going to add that to the toolbar. If you look at the filter HTML, we can see that there's a section with the class that we've configured this plugin to provide. And the diff should be also available with that class. So yeah, that is updated as we expect. If we would remove that, those would be removed from the filter HTML again. And so yeah, that is all based on what are the enabled plugins on your filter format. So I'm going to refresh this page. And now, if we add a to-call element, you can see that works. And when we added the element, it moved the selection to the first item. And you can nest complex elements here if you want. And that works. And if you look at the model, you can see that there's a to-call element with two calls, which has Drupal media inside it. Then we have a paragraph. We can also debug the status of the command on the commands tab. So we can see here should be insert to call. So you can see here is the status of that. So that's enabled here. So that means we could probably nest them. So now we have now we have multiple columns here. That's quite wild. Not sure, can I? That is actually sort of, I don't think I can select the full thing. So there's sort of a usability problem, which we just discovered. I don't think I can remove the second column inside. So now I'm going to try to remove it in the source editing. I'm going to insert the Drupal media again here. Then I'm going to try to save this one. So we can, oh. And yeah, there we have a two column layout element. It's part of the that we just created. Okay. So here's an URL for the full code base. So there's a couple small things on top of this that you have to add. So you can see all of that in here. But basically what I showed as part of the presentation is all that you need. Everything else is sort of just very simple boilerplate code that was added there. So just an info YAML file for the module and things like that. Something that helps, something that I was using as part of the demos is the CKEditor 5 dev module. As part of the CKEditor 5 dev module, there's a starter template if you want to create your own module with custom CKEditor 5 plugins. So that includes a working example of the Webpack DLL configuration that you would need. It also provides you with the CKEditor 5 inspector, which I was using for the demos. So that allows you to inspect the CKEditor 5 state, model, editing view, and commands, and so on. And we will probably extend the module with some additional examples, such as how to integrate upstream plugins using Webpack DLL. So yeah, you might be wondering that I was misleading when I was talking about paragraphs and structured data. After all, downcasting an element into just a div and section is not particularly exciting. That's something you can do with CKEditor 4 too. What you could do is you could do something. We could take this much further from there if we wanted to, but just for the purpose of the demo, it was not necessarily valuable enough. You could, for example, use a custom element for those, and then you could use a Drupal HTML filter for rendering that inside the template. So that would be something that you could do in Drupal, and that would be relatively straightforward. You could just follow the example of what we do on the Drupal Media Integration plugin. You could use the template to render the element using a custom element if you want it, and that would allow you to use Shadow DOM and inline CSS, which would allow you to render that element universally, which means that if you're doing headless stuff, you would have the styles coming from the template to the headless side. Or we could implement the custom data processor, which converts the CKEditor view into complex data structures, for example, similar to what the paragraphs is doing. So if we implemented a custom schema specific to that purpose, in theory, paragraphs could work using CKEditor 5 as a UI. Just food of thought if anyone is interested in taking a new project. So something that we are doing this week is we are testing the CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5 upgrade path. Here's a URL again to the to instructions on how to do that. So that is a very helpful way to help us get the CKEditor 5 stable and ready. It also ensures that later on, when you actually have to upgrade to CKEditor 5, when CKEditor 5 is the only editor available in Drupal, you will have a smooth upgrade path since you've already been able to test that early on. So yeah, thank you. That's all that I have. Do we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions? If anyone has questions, there's questions. I'm going to try to throw this.
One quick question. You mentioned that CKEditor 5 is all plugin based, and I'm assuming that we have a lot of plugins already as part of CKEditor 5 in the contrib module. Is there a list of plugins that are part of what's in contrib and what was left out?
I don't know if we have a list of the plugins anywhere in documentation. I think the best place to look for that would be in the CKEditor 5 YAML in the Drupal core module. That's where you can see all of the plugins that are in use in our integration that we provide in core. Okay. Then there's also contrib modules that are integrating to CKEditor 4 plugins, and we have a list of those modules. I don't know if we have a list of contrib modules that are integrating the CKEditor 5 plugins.
Yeah, I maintain a few of those, and I'm kind of interested in knowing what I have to do to. So first of all, if I actually need to to now maintain them in CKEditor 5? Because maybe they're part of what you're doing already, so they basically get redundant, or if it's even possible, maybe they're like obsolete by now. And some kind of UI from CKEditor 5, knowing what's in there or not, maybe might be helpful. I don't know. But thank you, and thanks a lot for the work you're doing.
Yeah, that's definitely something we need to figure out. So I think we are working with the CKEditor team on providing documentation about how to upgrade CKEditor 4 plugins to CKEditor 5. That explains replacement plugins in CKEditor 5, CKEditor 4 plugins that are obsolete when using CKEditor 5, and so on. So that would be something that I guess would help you also on determining how to upgrade a one plugin which is integrating to sort of upstream CKEditor 4
and by the way, a shameless plug, a lot of the work that's in CKEditor support for CKEditor 4 was made by the Ukrainian Drupal community. So I don't think any of them are here, of course, because reasons. But without those guys, those modules would be a lot harder to install in the Drupal. So thanks a lot for the Drupal community in Ukraine. And that's it.
Any other questions? Yeah, there's one.
Where?
Hi. A question about plugins in CKEditor 5. There's a on the CKEditor 5 website, they list quite a few plugins that are new, some custom people build stuff for CKEditor 5 now. But those are pure CKEditor 5 plugins. I guess they won't be immediately usable within Drupal because you need the DLL version or something like that.
Yeah, so CKEditor, when it comes to core plugins, they are providing DLL built for all of those. And then if there are contributor plugins that are outside of sort of the CKEditor organization, you can reach out to them and provide them. Maybe that's something we should also document. There's CKEditor 5 has dev documentation on how to create, how they expect contrib CKEditor 5 plugins to provide the Webpack DLL builds. So you could provide them with that and ask them to provide that as part of the releases that they do.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few interesting contrib CKEditor 5 plugins already.
Yeah.
But to get them into Drupal, you would need that.
Yes. Another way is potentially to do a mapping plugin, which would be a GitHub repository, which simply has a yarn dependency on that plugin, and it simply just provides the DLL build of that. So that would be if the maintainer would not be willing to support the DLL build of that plugin.
Okay.
I think that's it. If you have any additional questions, we are going to be around at the sprints. Feel free to join the sprints and come talk to us. We can then answer your questions. And if you are doing testing on CKEditor 4 to CKEditor 5, we are very interested in hearing how is your experience in doing that. Thank you.